On a rain-soaked October evening in Seattle, Nico Ramos crouches beneath the flickering streetlight outside Ashford Manor, his weathered hands wrapped around lukewarm coffee from the gas station. The 52-year-old man who once wired entire neighborhoods now carries his world in a backpack: tools, worn clothes, regrets. Storm pounds against wrought-iron gates of the billionaire's estate, where lights dance behind tall windows. Worlds away from his cardboard shelter under interstate overpass. When lightning strikes and plunges the mansion into darkness, Niko sees opportunity where others see misfortune. He approaches the gate, not as a beggar, but as a craftsman offering his trade. What happens when a tech billionaire woman discovers that sometimes the most valuable things come from unexpected places? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Pacific Northwest autumn had arrived with its familiar symphony of rain against pavement and the whisper of wind through evergreen branches. In the upscale Bellevue neighborhood, where Ashford Manor stood like a fortress of modern architecture and old money, the storm seemed almost decorative, a backdrop for the warm glow emanating from mansion windows where people lived lives insulated from weather's inconvenience. Nico Ramos had learned to read storms differently. At 52, his weathered face bore the map of a man who had traveled from promise to despair, each line earned through years of sleeping rough and working odd jobs that paid in meals rather than dignity. His hands, still steady despite everything, remained his most valuable assets, hands that had once installed electrical systems in Seattle's finest buildings, now reduced to begging for small repairs in exchange for food. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat on the concrete steps of a shuttered coffee shop, watching the lights flicker in the mansion across the street. 25 years ago, he had wired that very estate during its construction, back when Nico Ramos Electrical was more than just a faded business card in his wallet. Back when he had a crew, a reputation, and a future that stretched beyond the next meal, the business card had survived 3 years of homelessness, protected in a plastic sleeve that also held his expired driver's license and a photo of the Henderson family, the people whose lives he had changed forever with one moment of human error. Maria Henderson's smile in that photo still haunted him, her trusting expression captured just weeks before the accident that had destroyed more than just her family's new electrical panel. Inside the mansion's walls lived Juliet Ashford, the tech billionaire whose green energy empire had revolutionized how the world thought about sustainable power. At 48, she commanded boardrooms with the same precision she once used to code revolutionary software in her MIT dorm room. Her company, Ashford Renewable Solutions, had a market cap that exceeded the GDP of small nations, yet she remained famously reclusive, preferring the solitude of her private estate to the social circuits that other billionaires frequented. Tonight, as she worked late in her home office, reviewing acquisition proposals for solar farms across 3 continents, Juliet barely noticed the storm building outside. Her mind operated in algorithms and profit margins, in quarterly projections and environmental impact assessments. The homeless population of Seattle existed as statistics in the philanthropic reports her assistant prepared, numbers to be addressed through charitable donations and tax-deductible contributions to worthy causes. She had no way of knowing that, outside her gates, sat a man who understood electrical systems better than most of her highly paid engineers. A man whose current circumstances had nothing to do with his capabilities and everything to do with a single moment when life had pivoted from stability to chaos. 3 years earlier, Niko had been working a routine job, upgrading the electrical panel in a family home in Ballard. The Hendersons were expecting their second child, and Maria Henderson had been concerned about the old wiring's ability to handle modern appliances. It should have been a straightforward afternoon's work, the kind of job Niko had completed hundreds of times without incident. But on that particular Tuesday in March, exhaustion had clouded his judgment. He had been working 16-hour days, trying to keep his struggling business afloat after losing his two biggest commercial contracts to larger firms. When he connected the new panel, a momentary lapse, a wire placed in the wrong position for just seconds, had caused a power surge that started a fire in the basement. Maria Henderson had been doing laundry when the surge hit. The electrical fire spread quickly through the old wooden structure, and though she escaped with her life, the smoke inhalation had caused complications with her pregnancy. The baby, a little girl they had planned to name Sophia, was stillborn 3 days later. The investigation that followed had been thorough and merciless. Insurance investigators, looking for any reason to minimize their payout, had scrutinized every detail of Niko's work. They found the error, documented it, and built a case that painted him as a negligent contractor whose corner-cutting had led to tragedy. The fact that Niko had been operating without proper insurance, a desperate cost-cutting measure during his business's decline, made him personally liable for damages that exceeded $500,000. The civil lawsuit had consumed everything. His business, his home, his savings, even his tools, all seized to pay damages and legal fees. The criminal charges had been dropped when it became clear the fire was accidental, but the Henderson family's grief had needed a target, and Niko's mistake had made him that target. He understood their anger. In their position, he might have reacted the same way. What haunted him wasn't their accusations, but the knowledge that his moment of inattention had cost them their daughter. No amount of money could restore what they had lost, and no amount of penance could ease the weight of that responsibility. The final blow had come when the electrical contractor's licensing board revoked his credentials. Without a license, he couldn't work in his field legally. Without work, he couldn't afford the therapy and anger management classes the court had mandated. Without an address, he couldn't maintain his professional relationships or rebuild his reputation. The descent from respected businessman to homeless vagrant had taken 18 months. The first few weeks he had stayed with friends, confident that the situation was temporary, but as weeks became months and his welcome wore thin, he had found himself in shelters, then in his truck, and finally on the streets when the truck was repossessed. The Seattle streets had taught him lessons that 25 years of electrical work never had. He learned which doorways offered the best protection from rain, which convenience store clerks would let him use the bathroom, and which neighborhoods treated homeless people as invisible rather than threatening. He learned to swallow his pride and ask for work in exchange for food, to fix broken outlets and faulty switches for restaurant owners who paid him with leftover sandwiches and day-old pastries. Most of all, he learned that homelessness was not a character flaw or a choice, but a circumstance that could happen to anyone when enough dominoes fell in the wrong direction. The other people he met on the streets included veterans, former executives, teachers and nurses, people whose stories of loss and misfortune were as varied as they were heartbreaking. Yet even in his lowest moments, Niko never lost his love for electrical work. There was something almost spiritual about bringing power to dark places, about understanding the invisible forces that made modern life possible. When he closed his eyes at night, wrapped in cardboard under the interstate overpass, he sometimes dreamed in wire diagrams and voltage calculations, his mind still sharp despite his circumstances. Juliet's world, by contrast, operated at a level of abstraction that removed her from such immediate concerns. Her humanitarian projects were managed through foundations and non-profits. Her charitable giving filtered through tax advisors and public relations consultants. She genuinely cared about social issues. Her company's mission statement emphasized environmental responsibility and economic justice, but that caring was expressed through policy papers and board resolutions rather than direct human contact. Her isolation was both chosen and circumstantial. The death of her parents in a car accident when she was 26 had left her the sole heir to a technology fortune. But it had also left her wary of relationships that might be motivated by her wealth. She had never married, though there had been serious relationships over the years, each ending when the pressures of her public life and private nature proved incompatible with normal romantic expectations. At 48, she had achieved everything she had dreamed of as a young programmer. Her company was at the forefront of renewable energy technology. Her personal fortune allowed her to fund research projects that might change the world, and her influence extended from Silicon Valley boardrooms to United Nations climate summits. Yet she often found herself working late into the night, not because the work demanded it, but because the empty mansion felt more manageable when filled with the familiar glow of computer screens and the comforting hum of servers. Tonight was no different. As the storm intensified outside her office windows, Juliet reviewed proposals for a new initiative that had captured her imagination, a humanitarian housing project that would provide sustainable, off-grid homes for homeless populations in major cities. The concept combined her passion for green technology with her desire to address social inequality, creating self-sufficient communities powered entirely by renewable energy. The irony was profound. As she studied charts and projections about homeless populations, one of those statistics sat less than 100 yards from her front gate, possessing exactly the skills her project would need to succeed, yet completely invisible to her world of consultants and contractors. The storm that was about to change. Both their lives had been building all day, drawing power from the collision of warm Pacific air with the cold front moving down from Canada. Weather services had issued warnings about potential power outages, but in neighborhoods like Bellevue's prestigious hills, such warnings were more inconvenience than genuine concern. Backup generators and redundant systems protected the wealthy from most of nature's disruptions, but even the most sophisticated systems could fail, and when lightning found the transformer that served Ashford Manor's grid connection, the perfectly ordered world inside those walls would go dark, creating the circumstances for an encounter that neither Niko nor Juliet could have imagined. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Niko finished his gas station coffee and checked the contents of his backpack. His toolkit was smaller now than it had been in his professional days, but it contained the essentials: wire strippers, electrical tape, a multimeter that still worked despite its cracked display, and the muscle memory of thousands of successful repairs. These tools had kept him fed for 3 years, trading his knowledge for kindness in a world that had largely forgotten his name. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, those same tools would open a door to possibilities he had stopped allowing himself to imagine, a door that would change not just his own life, but the life of the woman whose world was about to go dark. The lightning strike came without warning, a brilliant fork of electricity that split the Seattle sky and found its target with surgical precision. The transformer serving Ashford Manor's electrical grid absorbed the bolt's fury for a microsecond, before surrendering in a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the storm-darkened street. Inside the mansion, Juliet's world went black. The sudden absence of her computer's hum, the silence where climate control systems had whispered, the darkness that swallowed her carefully lit office, all of it hit her like a physical blow. She sat frozen for a moment, her eyes struggling to adjust, her mind automatically calculating the cost of lost work and corrupted data. Emergency lighting should have activated within seconds, but the minutes stretched on in oppressive darkness. From his position across the street, Niko watched the mansion's lights die one by one, as if someone were turning off switches in a deliberate sequence. He had seen enough electrical failures to recognize the signature of a major grid disruption. This wasn't a simple blown fuse or tripped breaker. This was the kind of catastrophic failure that would require professional intervention. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting on cold concrete, and shouldered his backpack. The storm was intensifying, and his cardboard shelter under the overpass would be soaked within the hour. But more importantly, somewhere in that darkened mansion was a person who needed exactly the kind of help he could provide. The wrought-iron gates that normally buzzed with electronic security stood silent and slightly ajar, a detail that spoke to the thoroughness of the power failure. Even the backup systems had been overwhelmed. Niko approached the entrance with the measured confidence of someone who belonged there, a posture learned from decades of entering homes and businesses as a welcome professional rather than an unwanted vagrant. The intercom system was dead, of course, but he could see the warm glow of what looked like candles or flashlights moving behind the mansion's windows. Someone was home, someone was struggling with the darkness, and someone needed his help. He pushed through the gate and walked up the circular driveway, his worn boots splashing through puddles that reflected the occasional flash of lightning. The mansion loomed above him, its architectural grandeur reduced to a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. As he approached the front door, he could hear movement inside, the sound of furniture being bumped into, the muffled curse of someone navigating familiar spaces made foreign by darkness. Niko knocked firmly but politely, the way he had announced himself to thousands of customers over the years. The movement inside stopped immediately, replaced by a silence that suggested wariness rather than absence. "Mom," he called through the heavy door, his voice carrying the calm authority of professional competence. "I'm an electrician. I saw your power go out, and I'm here to help." The silence stretched longer, and he could almost feel the person inside weighing their options. A strange man at the door during a storm, offering help that seemed too convenient to be trustworthy. In her position, he would be suspicious too. "I don't need any help," came a woman's voice finally, carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of uncertainty. "The power company will restore service." "Not tonight, they won't," Niko replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than argumentative. "That transformer took a direct lightning hit. You're looking at 12 to 18 hours minimum. Before they can get a crew out here, maybe longer with this storm." Another silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. He heard the mechanical click of multiple locks disengaging, expensive, sophisticated locks that required manual operation when the power failed. The door opened a few inches, revealing a woman's face illuminated by the weak glow of a smartphone flashlight. Even in the poor light, he could see intelligence in her eyes, along with the kind of wariness that came from being wealthy and alone during a crisis. "Who are you?" she asked directly. "Nico Ramos," he said, instinctively reaching for the business card in his wallet before remembering its obsolete status. "I've been doing electrical work in Seattle for 25 years. I was across the street when the lightning hit, and I know exactly what happened to your system." She studied his face for a long moment, taking in his weathered appearance and the worn backpack slung over his shoulder. Her gaze lingered on his hands, clean despite his circumstances, with the calluses and small scars that marked a lifetime of working with tools and electrical components. "You said you're an electrician," she said carefully. "Do you have credentials?" "A business license?" The question hit like a physical blow, bringing back all the shame and loss of the past 3 years. He could lie, could maintain the fiction of professional status, but something in this woman's direct gaze demanded honesty. "Not anymore," he admitted. "I lost my license 3 years ago, but I still know how to restore your power, at least temporarily. Your backup generators should have kicked in by now. The fact that they didn't means this surge damaged more than just your main connection." He reached into his backpack and pulled out his multimeter, its cracked but functional display catching the light from her phone. "I'm not asking for money, just a sandwich and maybe a cup of coffee. In exchange, I'll get your power back on tonight instead of next week." Juliet Ashford stood in her doorway, studying this unexpected visitor with the analytical mind that had built her fortune. Everything about the situation screamed danger, a stranger appearing during a storm, claiming expertise while obviously homeless, asking to enter her home when security systems were down. Every rational instinct told her to close the door and wait for morning, but there was something in his manner that gave her pause. The calm confidence in his voice when he described the electrical failure. The way he held the meter like a familiar tool rather than a prop. The specificity of his assessment, 12 to 18 hours, spoke to genuine experience rather than opportunistic improvisation. "How do I know you're really an electrician?" she asked. Niko looked up at the mansion's facade, his eyes tracing lines invisible to anyone without his training. "You've got a main panel in the basement, probably a 400-amp service with separate feeds for your home automation system and HVAC. The backup generators are likely natural gas, maybe 50 kW capacity, with automatic transfer switches that should have engaged within 30 seconds of power loss." He pointed to a section of the roofline. "But you've also got solar panels. I can see the inverter housing from here. And if the surge hit while they were feeding power back to the grid, it could have damaged the transfer switch controls. That's why your generators didn't start." Juliet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. His assessment was remarkably accurate. He had described her electrical system with the kind of detail that would require either extensive knowledge or inside information. Since she was certain no one had briefed him on her home's specifications, his knowledge had to be genuine. "Wait here," she said, closing the door partially while she considered her options. The rational choice was obvious. Wait for morning. Call. Her usual contractors deal with the inconvenience of a night without power, but something about this man's straightforward manner intrigued her. In her world of corporate politics and calculated interactions, genuine expertise was often wrapped in layers of consulting fees and professional credentials. Here was someone offering knowledge for a sandwich, an exchange so fundamentally honest. It felt almost revolutionary. She opened the door wider. "Just the electrical work," she said firmly. "Then you leave." "Understood," Niko replied, stepping into the mansion's foyer with the careful respect of someone who understood the privilege of being trusted. As Juliet led him through darkened hallways toward the basement, neither of them could have imagined that this simple transaction, expertise exchanged for basic sustenance, would become the foundation for something that would transform both their lives. But in the darkness of that storm-battered night, with lightning illuminating their path and the tools of Niko's forgotten profession clutched in his steady hands, the first threads of an extraordinary connection were already being woven. The basement of Ashford Manor was a testament to both luxury and practicality, its finished walls concealing the complex infrastructure that made modern comfort possible. As Juliet led Niko down carpeted stairs by the light of her phone, he felt the familiar anticipation that came with approaching an electrical puzzle. This was his element, the hidden world of circuits and connections that most people took for granted until something went wrong. The electrical room was exactly as he had predicted. A sophisticated setup with multiple panels, backup systems, and enough redundancy to power a small office building. But as his flashlight beams swept across the equipment, Niko could see the evidence of the lightning strike's violence. Scorch marks on the main disconnect, the acrid smell of burned components, and the telltale silence where transfer switches should have been humming with readiness. "Your assessment was correct," he said, setting down his backpack and removing his tools with practiced efficiency. "The surge came in through the main service and overwhelmed your protection systems. Your backup generators are fine, but the automatic transfer switches got fried. That's why they never engaged." Juliet watched him work, noting the immediate change in his demeanor as he entered his professional zone. The deference of a homeless man seeking charity disappeared, replaced by the quiet confidence of an expert diagnosing a complex problem. His hands moved with sure precision as he tested connections and traced circuits, his multimeter providing the electronic heartbeat that would guide his repairs. "How long will this take?" she asked. holding her phone light steady as he worked. "Getting your generators online? Maybe an hour," Niko replied, already deep in the manual transfer switch housing. "Getting everything back to normal? That'll require parts and probably a full day's work, but I can get you power, heat, and lights tonight." As he worked, Juliet found herself studying this unexpected visitor more carefully. Despite his obviously difficult circumstances, there was nothing desperate or hurried about his approach. He worked methodically, testing each connection before proceeding, explaining what he was doing in terms that showed respect for her intelligence without condescending. Technical jargon. "You said you lost your license," she said eventually. "What happened?" Niko's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "I made a mistake. A family got hurt because of my error, and the licensing board decided I was too much of a liability to work in the field anymore." "What kind of mistake?" This time he did stop, looking up at her with an expression that carried 3 years of practiced explanations. From his wallet he pulled out a worn photograph. The Henderson family, smiling in what looked like a backyard. Barbecue setting. Maria Henderson held a small boy, while her husband had his arm around her obviously pregnant form. "House fire," he said simply. "Electrical surge caused by a wiring error I made. Maria Henderson was doing laundry when it started. She got out, but the smoke—" He trailed off, returning the photo to his wallet. "They lost the baby." Juliet felt something shift in her understanding of the man working in her basement. This wasn't a story of addiction or bad choices leading to homelessness. This was tragedy, the kind of professional accident that could happen to anyone, but had happened to him. "The insurance investigation found you at fault?" "Completely," Niko said, returning to his work with hands that remained steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "I'd been working 16-hour days, trying to save my business. Made a connection wrong for maybe 30 seconds before I caught it and fixed it, but that was enough." The generators rumbled to life with a deep, satisfying growl that echoed through the basement. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the house, casting everything in a pale but welcome glow. Within minutes, the familiar hum of climate control systems joined the chorus of restored comfort. "There," Niko said, satisfaction evident in his voice as he packed his tools. "You've got power, heat, and basic lighting. Your main services. Still damaged, but this'll keep you comfortable until professionals can do the permanent repairs." Juliet looked around the now illuminated basement, noting the precision of his temporary connections and the care he had taken to label everything. Clearly for the next electrician who would work on the system. "You said something about a sandwich." "If it's not too much trouble," Niko replied, shouldering his backpack. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." "Come upstairs," she said, leading him toward the kitchen. "We can do better than a sandwich." The kitchen was a chef's dream, all granite counters and professional appliances, but Juliet moved through it with the efficiency of someone who actually cooked rather than merely entertained. As she assembled ingredients for what looked like a substantial meal, Niko sat at the breakfast bar, still somewhat amazed to find himself inside this world of quiet luxury. "Tell me about your business," Juliet said as she worked. "Before the accident." "Nico Ramos Electrical," he said, the words carrying a mixture of pride and loss. "Started it 22 years ago, right after I finished my apprenticeship. Specialized in residential and small commercial work, had a good reputation, steady crew, more work than we could handle most years." He pulled the faded business card from his wallet, its edges soft with age and handling. "This is all that's left of it now. Sometimes I look at it and wonder if I dreamed the whole thing." Juliet glanced at the card as she set a plate of food in front of him. Not a simple sandwich, but a carefully prepared meal with pasta, grilled vegetables, and bread that looked freshly baked. 22 years is a long time to build something. Gone. In 18 months, Niko said, looking at the food with an expression that spoke to how long it had been since anyone had prepared a meal specifically for him. After the lawsuit, after the license revocation, after the bankruptcy. Amazing how fast a life can unravel when the right dominoes start falling. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the storm continuing to rage outside the kitchen windows. Juliet found herself watching Niko with growing curiosity. Despite everything he had lost, there was no bitterness in his manner, no self-pity or blame directed toward others. He spoke about his circumstances with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had made peace with reality, however harsh it might be. "What do you do now?" she asked. "For work, I mean." "Odd jobs, mostly. Small electrical repairs for restaurant owners, convenience stores, anyone willing to pay in food rather than cash. Word gets around among small business owners that there's a guy who can fix their problems without calling expensive contractors. It's not legal, technically, but it keeps me fed." "And where do you—" She hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question delicately. "Sleep?" Niko finished for her. "Under the interstate overpass about 2 miles from here. There's a spot where the concrete provides decent shelter, and the traffic noise keeps away some of the more dangerous elements. It's not the Ritz, but it's better than some places I've tried." Juliet set down her fork, something stirring in her mind, a connection between this man's story and a project that had been occupying her thoughts for months. "You know, I've been working on something that might interest you, a humanitarian initiative involving sustainable housing for homeless populations, off-grid electrical systems, solar power, that sort of thing." Niko looked up from his meal, interest flickering in his eyes. "Sounds ambitious. Most homeless housing projects fail because they don't understand the real challenges of the population they're trying to serve." "What do you mean?" "Most people think homelessness is about not having a roof over your head, but it's really about not having control over your environment, your safety, your basic dignity. Give someone a bed in a shelter, but make them leave. At 6 a.m. every day, don't let them have privacy or store their belongings safely, and you haven't really solved anything. You've just created a different kind of problem." Juliet nodded slowly, recognizing the voice of genuine expertise born from lived experience rather than academic study. "What would you do differently?" "Start with understanding that homeless people aren't broken," Niko said. "They're displaced. Most of them have skills, knowledge, experience. They need opportunity more than charity. Give them a chance to contribute, to use their abilities, to rebuild, rather than just survive." As the conversation continued, both Niko and Juliet felt something unexpected happening. The recognition of intellectual equals meeting across a vast divide of circumstance. Neither could have predicted that this storm-forced encounter would become the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and the distance between different worlds. The guest bedroom on the mansion's second floor felt like stepping into another world. Clean sheets, soft lighting from bedside lamps, and a bathroom with hot water and fresh towels. Luxuries that Niko had almost forgotten existed. As he stood under the shower, watching 3 years of accumulated grime swirl down the drain, he tried to process the surreal turn his evening had taken. Juliet had insisted he stay the night, pointing out that the storm was still raging and that his usual shelter would be uninhabitable until morning. Her offer had been matter-of-fact, practical rather than pitying, which made it possible for him to accept without losing what remained of his dignity. Now, wearing a clean t-shirt and sweatpants that Juliet had provided, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the storm that had changed his circumstances so dramatically. Lightning still flickered in the distance, but the immediate fury had passed, leaving behind the steady rhythm of rain against glass. He pulled out the Henderson family photo once more, studying their faces in the lamplight. For 3 years, this image had served as both reminder and penance, a daily confrontation with the consequences of his mistake. But tonight, for the first time since the accident, he felt something other than crushing guilt when he looked at their smiles. Maybe it was the simple human kindness Juliet had shown him, Or maybe it was the unfamiliar sensation of sleeping indoors. But he found himself wondering if there might be a way forward that honored their loss without demanding his own destruction. Downstairs, Juliet sat in her home office, ostensibly reviewing emails, but actually processing the evening's unexpected encounter. She had built her fortune by trusting her instincts about people and opportunities, and every instinct told her that Nico Ramos represented something significant, though what exactly she couldn't yet define. On her computer screen, she pulled up the preliminary reports for her humanitarian housing project. The concept was ambitious: create sustainable off-grid communities that could provide not just shelter, but genuine homes for displaced populations. Solar power, rainwater collection, community gardens, and most importantly, opportunities for residents to contribute their skills and rebuild their lives. The project had been stalled for months by a fundamental problem. Her team of consultants and architects understood green technology and sustainable design, but they lacked any real understanding of the population they were trying to serve. Their proposals read like high-end eco-resorts rather than practical solutions for people who had learned to survive on the margins of society. But Niko's insights during their conversation had illuminated the gap in her thinking. He spoke about homelessness with the authority of lived experience, but also with the analytical mind of someone who understood complex systems. His comments about dignity, control, and the need for contribution rather than charity had reframed her entire approach to the project. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Chen, her assistant, and one of the few people whose judgment she trusted completely. Despite the late hour, he answered on the second ring. "Marcus, I need you to run a background check on someone," she said without preamble. "Nico Ramos, formerly of Nico Ramos Electrical here in Seattle. I want everything: business records, the lawsuit that ended his career, character references, from before his troubles. Full report by morning." "Everything okay, Juliet?" Marcus asked, his tone carrying the concern of someone who had worked with her long enough to recognize unusual requests. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, "but I think I may have found the missing piece for the housing project." The next morning brought weak Seattle sunshine and the sounds of emergency crews working to restore power throughout the city. Niko woke to the unfamiliar luxury of having slept through the night without interruption. No police flashlights, no territorial disputes with other homeless individuals, no urgent need to relocate before dawn. He found Juliet in the kitchen, already dressed for business and surrounded by laptops, papers, and the kind of organized chaos that suggested someone accustomed to managing multiple complex projects simultaneously. "Coffee?" she offered, gesturing toward a pot that smelled significantly better than anything he had tasted in years. "Thank you," he said, accepting a mug and noting that she had prepared a breakfast spread that looked suspiciously deliberate for someone who claimed to live alone. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "Actually, I did," Juliet replied, her tone carrying a new note of business-like intensity. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I have a proposition for you." She pulled out a tablet and showed him detailed architectural renderings of small, efficiently designed homes surrounded by community spaces and green infrastructure. "This is the humanitarian housing project I mentioned. Sustainable, off-grid communities for homeless populations. Solar power, community gardens, workshop spaces where residents can pursue trades and businesses." Niko studied the images with growing interest. The design was sophisticated but practical, clearly the work of talented architects who understood both environmental systems and human needs. "Impressive. What's the timeline?" "That's the problem," Juliet said. "We've been planning this for 2 years, but every time we think we have a workable design, we discover we're missing something fundamental about the reality of homelessness. Our consultants understand sustainable technology, but they don't understand the people who would actually live in these communities." She turned the tablet toward herself and pulled up a different screen. "Financial projections, implementation, schedules and sitemaps for locations in 3 cities. I want you to join the project, not as a consultant or advisor, but as a full partner in developing the electrical and infrastructure systems. Niko set down his coffee cup, certain he had misunderstood. I appreciate the thought, but I told you, I don't have a license anymore. I can't legally work as an electrician. You don't need a license to be a systems designer, Juliet replied, and you don't need a license to oversee installations done by licensed contractors. What you have is something more valuable than credentials. You understand both the technical requirements and the human realities. She pulled out a folder thick with documents. Marcus did some research last night. Your reputation before the Henderson accident was exceptional. Clients, suppliers, other contractors, everyone spoke about your integrity and skill. The accident was tragic, but it was genuinely an accident. One mistake in 25 years of flawless work. Niko felt his chest tighten. For 3 years, he had lived with the assumption that his professional reputation had been irreparably destroyed, that the Henderson case had overshadowed everything he had accomplished before. To learn that people still remembered his work favorably felt almost impossible to process. Even if that's true, he said carefully, I can't accept what sounds like charity. I won't be anyone's pet project or redemption story. This isn't charity, Juliet said firmly. This is business. I need someone who understands homeless populations from the inside. Someone who can design infrastructure that actually works for the people who will use it. You need an opportunity to rebuild your professional life. It's a fair exchange. She slid a document across the table, a formal consulting agreement with terms that made Niko's head spin. The compensation alone was more money than he had seen since before his business collapsed. But beyond the financial terms was something even more valuable, the chance to use his skills for something meaningful. There are conditions, Juliet continued. You'd need to work with our legal team to ensure everything you do complies with licensing requirements. All actual electrical work would be performed by licensed contractors under your direction. And you'd need to accept housing and support services. You can't effectively advocate for homeless communities while remaining homeless yourself. Niko looked out the kitchen window at the morning light filtering through the trees that surrounded the mansion. 3 years ago, he had been a respected businessman with a crew, a reputation, and a future. Last night, he had been a homeless man grateful for a sandwich. Now, he was being offered a chance to rebuild not just his own life, but to help rebuild the lives of people who faced the same struggles he had endured. Why, he asked finally, why take this risk on someone like me? Juliet met his gaze directly. Because yesterday I had a project that looked good on paper but would probably fail in practice. Today I have a partner who can help me build something that might actually work. Sometimes the most valuable things come from the most unexpected places. As Niko considered her offer, both of them sensed that they stood at a threshold, not just of a business partnership, but of possibilities neither had imagined when the storm brought them together. The Henderson family photo in his wallet seemed to weigh less heavily, as if their memory might be honored not through his continued suffering, but through his commitment to preventing others from experiencing similar loss. 3 weeks after the storm that changed everything, Niko stood in the conference room of Ashford Renewable Solutions, studying architectural blueprints spread across a table that could have seated 20 people. The corporate headquarters occupied an entire floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. The transformation in his circumstances still felt surreal. Clean clothes, a modest apartment near the university district, and most importantly, work that engaged his mind and skills in ways he had almost forgotten were possible. The humanitarian housing project, officially named Second Chance Communities, had become his consuming passion, a chance to channel decades of electrical expertise towards solving problems that most engineers never considered. In his hands, He held the latest version of the Ashford Renewable Solutions annual report, its glossy pages detailing the company's expansion into humanitarian infrastructure. The document outlined ambitious plans for off-grid housing communities in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco, complete with solar microgrids, rainwater harvesting systems, and community workshops where residents could develop skills and start small businesses. "The board meeting is in an hour," Marcus Chen said, entering the conference room with the brisk efficiency that had made him indispensable to Juliet's operation. At 35, Marcus combined the analytical mind of a former investment banker with a genuine understanding of social justice issues, a combination that made him both effective and trusted in his role as liaison between Juliet's vision and corporate reality. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, noting the way Niko was studying the financial projections with intense concentration. "As ready as someone can be for their first board presentation," Niko replied, closing the report and straightening his tie, a piece of clothing he hadn't worn in 3 years. "Though I still feel like I'm wearing someone else's life." The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings, consultations, and planning sessions. Juliet had moved quickly to formalize Niko's role in the company, creating a new position that allowed him to contribute his expertise while staying within the legal boundaries imposed by his licensing situation. He had worked with architects to refine housing designs, consulted with urban planners about site selection, and most importantly, interviewed dozens of homeless individuals to understand their needs and priorities. The work felt like coming home to himself in ways he hadn't expected. Every conversation with potential residents, every refinement to the electrical systems, every problem solved, reminded him of who he had been before the Henderson accident, a skilled professional who took a pride in creating solutions that improved people's lives. But today's board meeting represented a crucial test. The project required substantial investment, and some of Ashford Renewable's executives had expressed skepticism about both the concept and Niko's role in developing it. The numbers were compelling. The communities would be profitable within 5 years while providing genuine solutions for urban homelessness. But corporate boards were notoriously conservative about ventures that combined social missions with business objectives. "Juliet's already in the boardroom," Marcus said, checking his watch. "She wanted to handle the introductory presentations before bringing you in for the technical details." As they walked through corridors lined with awards and patents that testified to Ashford Renewable's success, Niko reflected on how dramatically his relationship with Juliet had evolved. The initial wariness had given way to mutual respect, then to something approaching partnership. She had a remarkable ability to understand complex systems, whether technical, financial, or social, and to identify the leverage points where small changes could create significant results. More than that, she seemed genuinely committed to using her wealth and influence to address problems that most billionaires ignored or addressed only through charitable donations. The Second Chance Communities project represented a different approach, sustainable solutions that treated homeless individuals as capable partners rather than passive recipients of aid. The boardroom occupied a corner of the building, its windows offering views in 2 directions, and its polished table reflecting the faces of 12 executives who collectively managed billions of dollars in renewable energy investments. As Niko entered behind Marcus, he could feel the weight of their attention, some curious, some skeptical, all calculating the risk and opportunity represented by his presence. Juliet stood at the head of the table, her presentation display showing detailed financial models for the housing communities. She had already covered the market analysis and competitive landscape, judging by the charts visible on her laptop screen. Now, she was addressing the implementation timeline. The electrical and infrastructure systems represent the most complex aspect of the project, she was saying as Niko took his seat, Traditional approaches to homeless housing fail because they treat residents as temporary occupants rather than permanent community members. Our design philosophy is different. We're creating sustainable neighborhoods where residents have control over their environment and opportunities to contribute their skills. Sarah Chen, the company's vice president of strategic development, leaned forward with the expression that suggested skepticism barely contained by corporate politeness. At 42, she had built her career on identifying and eliminating business risks, and everything about her body language indicated that she viewed the current project as exactly the kind of risk that should be eliminated. "The concept sounds admirable," Sarah said, her tone carefully neutral, "but I'm concerned about the execution timeline. Infrastructure projects of this complexity typically require years of planning and regulatory approval. The aggressive schedule you're proposing seems unrealistic." "That's where Niko's expertise becomes crucial," Juliet replied, gesturing for him to join her at the presentation display. His background includes not just electrical systems design, but extensive experience with regulatory processes and community integration. "Niko, would you walk the board through your technical approach?" Niko stood and moved to the display, feeling the familiar confidence that came with discussing work he understood thoroughly. The nervousness he had felt earlier disappeared as he began explaining the modular design philosophy that would allow rapid deployment while meeting all safety and efficiency requirements. "The key insight," he began, "is that homeless communities already exist. They're just invisible and lacking infrastructure. Our approach identifies existing informal settlements and provides them with sustainable utilities and legitimate legal status. Instead of relocating people, we upgrade their current situations." He clicked through slides showing electrical distribution, schemes, solar array configurations, and community workshop designs. Each slide represented weeks of detailed planning, consultations with homeless individuals, and coordination with city planning departments. "The electrical systems are designed for resilience and expandability," he continued. "Each housing unit includes basic power, but residents can add capacity for workshops, businesses, or extended families. The community microgrids can operate independently or connect to the main electrical grid, depending on circumstances." Board members began asking technical questions about costs, maintenance requirements, scalability, and regulatory compliance. Niko answered each query with specific data and real-world examples, drawing on his decades of electrical experience and his recent intensive study of sustainable infrastructure. As the questions continued, he could sense the mood in the room shifting. The detailed technical knowledge he presented, combined with his obvious understanding of homeless populations' practical needs, was building credibility for the project. Even Sarah Chen's skepticism seemed to be moderating as she recognized the thoroughness of his planning. "The financial projections assume full occupancy within 18 months, said Robert Martinez, the chief financial officer. "Is that realistic given the target population?" "More than realistic," Niko replied. "We already have waiting lists at all 3 proposed sites. The demand for stable, dignified housing among homeless populations far exceeds current supply. The challenge isn't attracting residents, it's providing enough units to meet demand." Juliet smiled slightly, recognizing the confidence in Niko's voice that came from genuine expertise rather than corporate optimism. Over the past 3 weeks, she had watched him transform from a man grateful for basic kindness into a professional, advocate for some of society's most marginalized people. The change was remarkable not just in terms of his circumstances, but in his sense of purpose and possibility. "The board will need time to review these materials," Sarah said, gathering her papers with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling meeting agendas. "This represents a significant departure from our traditional business model." "It represents an evolution of our business model," Juliet corrected gently. Ashford Renewable has always been about more than just profit. We're about creating sustainable solutions for human needs. This project applies that mission to one of our society's most pressing challenges. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out with varying expressions of interest and concern, Niko felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had presented his case as clearly and completely as possible. Now the decision rested with people who would weigh social impact against financial risk, innovation against corporate stability. "That went well," Marcus said as they gathered presentation materials. "Sarah's questions were tough, but you handled them like someone who actually knows what he's talking about." "Because I do know what I'm talking about," Niko replied, surprised by his own certainty. "For the first time in 3 years, I'm working on something that uses everything I've learned about electrical systems, about business, about what it means to lose everything and try to rebuild." Juliet approached as they finished packing up. "The vote is scheduled for next week. Whatever they decide, you should know that this presentation was exactly what the project needed. You made the case better than any consultant could have." As they left the boardroom together, none of them could have predicted that their success would soon attract exactly the kind of attention they least wanted, or that forces beyond their control were already moving to challenge everything they had worked to build. The prototype solar panel array stretched across the roof of the converted warehouse like a metallic garden, its photovoltaic cells gleaming in the afternoon sun. Niko stood on the rooftop with a tablet in his hands, monitoring the real-time data streaming from his latest innovation, a modular solar system designed specifically for the Second Chance Communities project. 2 months had passed since the board's unanimous approval of the housing initiative, and the first pilot community was taking shape in an industrial district south of downtown Seattle. The warehouse below had been transformed into a combination workshop, community center, and temporary housing facility, where the first residents were already beginning to build new lives. The efficiency ratings are exceeding projections by 12%. Niko called to Juliet, who was examining the battery storage systems that would allow the community to operate independently of the electrical grid during emergencies. "The modular design is working exactly as intended. Residents can add capacity as their needs grow." Juliet climbed the ladder to join him on the roof, her business attire replaced by work clothes that showed she'd been spending hands-on time with the construction process. Over the past weeks, she had surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming deeply involved in the day-to-day development of the communities rather than simply providing executive oversight. "Show me the residential integration," she said, moving to stand beside him as he scrolled through screens displaying power consumption data from individual housing units. The solar array represented more than just an electrical system. It was a testament to Niko's ability to innovate when given resources and creative freedom. Traditional solar installations were designed for stable, permanent structures with predictable power needs. But the Second Chance communities required something more flexible, systems that could grow organically, accommodate residents with varying skills and ambitions, and provide both basic necessities and opportunities for economic development. "Each housing unit starts with a basic 2-kilowatt allocation," Niko explained, pointing to different sections of the array. "But residents can request additional capacity for workshops, small businesses, or extended family members." The modular design means we can add panels without rewiring the entire system. Below them, the sound of construction echoed through the warehouse as residents worked alongside professional contractors to build their own living spaces. It was a sight that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. Homeless individuals using power tools and construction equipment to create their own housing, guided by architects and engineers, but maintaining control over their environment. The success of the pilot project had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Urban planners from other cities were requesting site visits. Social workers were referring clients. Most surprisingly, major corporations were inquiring about partnerships and investment opportunities. But the attention had also brought scrutiny that made both Niko and Juliet increasingly uncomfortable. Media coverage had shifted from local human interest stories to national profiles that focused more on their personal relationship than on the communities they were building. Photographers with long lenses had been spotted near the construction site. Corporate competitors were asking pointed questions about Ashford Renewable's new direction. "Marcus called this morning," Juliet said, her tone carrying a note of concern that had become more frequent recently. "3 more news outlets want interviews about our partnership. They're not interested in the housing project. They want to know about the billionaire and the homeless man who's become her business partner." Niko felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with unwanted attention. The success of the project should have been purely satisfying, but the media narrative was reducing their work to a simplistic feel-good story that missed the complexity of what they were actually accomplishing. "We could limit media access," he suggested, though he knew that approach had its own risks. "Focus on showing the communities rather than talking about ourselves." "Sarah thinks we should go in the opposite direction," Juliet replied, referring to the vice president, who had become increasingly vocal about her concerns. "Full media engagement, control the narrative, use the attention to attract more investment." They climbed down from the roof and entered the warehouse, where the transformation was even more dramatic. What had been an empty industrial space 3 months earlier now buzzed with purposeful activity. Residents were learning solar panel installation, basic electrical work, and small-scale manufacturing. A corner of the space had been converted into a community kitchen where people shared meals and informal job training. In the center of the warehouse, a bulletin board displayed job placement successes. Former residents who had found permanent employment, started small businesses, or moved into traditional housing. The numbers were modest but meaningful. 43 people had transitioned through the program, with an 85% success rate in maintaining stable housing after 6 months. "Niko," called Maria Santos, a former software engineer who had been homeless for 2 years before joining the community. She was now training other residents in basic computer skills and helping them create resumes. "The Lopez family wants to add a workspace module to their unit. Can you review their electrical requirements?" As Niko walked over to consult with the family about their small tailoring business, Juliet watched with something approaching wonder. This was what she had hoped to achieve when she started Ashford Renewable, technology that genuinely improved people's lives rather than simply generating profits. But more than that, she was witnessing Niko's complete transformation from the desperate man who had knocked on her door during a storm to someone who was becoming a recognized expert in sustainable community development. The romantic feelings that had been building between them over the past months were complicated by the professional success they were achieving together. Late nights spent planning construction schedules had become conversations about broader social issues. Working dinners had evolved into personal discussions about their hopes for the future. Yet both of them remained cautious about crossing professional boundaries that might complicate their partnership. "Juliet," Sarah Chen called from near the warehouse entrance, her voice carrying the urgency that usually preceded difficult conversations. "We need to talk privately." Juliet excused herself and joined Sarah outside, where her vice president was holding a tablet displaying what looked like financial reports and news articles. "We have a problem," Sarah said without preamble. "Someone's been asking questions about Niko's background, detailed questions about the Henderson case, his bankruptcy, the circumstances that led to his homelessness." "What kind of questions?" Juliet asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Corporate intelligence type questions, the kind that come before hostile media coverage or business attacks. Someone wants to discredit either Niko personally or the community's project generally," Sarah handed over the tablet, showing news articles from business publications that had begun questioning Ashford Renewable's new direction. The coverage was subtle but pointed, raising concerns about liability issues, questioning the wisdom of hiring unlicensed contractors, suggesting that the company was prioritizing social causes over shareholder interests. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I've been hearing rumors about a potential hostile takeover attempt. Someone's been quietly acquiring Ashford Renewable stock and asking questions about our board composition." Juliet felt cold, despite the afternoon warmth. She had built her company by taking calculated risks and trusting her instincts about people and opportunities. But she had also succeeded by being careful about corporate politics and competitive threats. The success of the community's project was making both her and the company visible in ways that attracted not just positive attention, but potential adversaries. "Do we know who's behind the inquiries?" she asked. "Not yet, but the pattern suggests professional opposition research. Someone with significant resources wants to find weaknesses they can exploit." As they talked, Niko emerged from the warehouse with plans for the Lopez family's workshop expansion. He noticed their serious expressions and the way their conversation stopped when he approached. "Everything okay?" he asked. Juliet looked at him, this man who had become so important to both her work and her personal life, and realized that their success was about to be tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. The communities they were building represented hope for hundreds of homeless individuals, but they also represented a threat to established ways of thinking about poverty, business, and social responsibility. "We may have some challenges ahead," she said carefully. "People who don't like what we're accomplishing here." Niko nodded slowly, recognizing the weight of what she wasn't saying directly. He had learned during his 3 years on the streets that success often attracted opposition, especially when that success challenged assumptions about who deserved opportunities and second chances. "Then we'll deal with whatever comes," he said simply. "We've got something worth protecting here." As the three of them stood outside the warehouse, watching residents work on their homes and businesses inside, none of them could have imagined how soon and how dramatically their commitment would be tested. But they were about to discover that some forces would go to extraordinary lengths to prevent formerly homeless individuals from proving that they deserved dignity, opportunity, and hope. The legal settlement document arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier to Niko's apartment with the kind of official gravity that suggested life-changing news. As he signed for the thick manila envelope, he had no way of knowing that the papers inside would reveal a conspiracy that reached back 3 years to the Henderson family tragedy and forward to the present threat against everything he and Juliet had built together. Marcus. Chen had requested the meeting at a downtown law office rather than Ashford Renewable's headquarters, a location choice that immediately suggested the sensitivity of what they were about to discuss. The conference room occupied a corner of the building, its windows offering views of Elliott Bay while maintaining the privacy necessary for conversations that could reshape lives and corporations. "Before we begin," said attorney Jennifer Walsh, a woman whose reputation for handling complex corporate investigations had made her Juliet's first choice when the hostile takeover rumors intensified, "I need you to understand that what you're about to learn will fundamentally change your understanding." Of the past 3 years, Niko sat between Juliet and Marcus, the settlement document unopened on the table before him. Over the past week, as evidence of organized opposition to their community's project had mounted, he had felt the familiar sensation of forces beyond his control gathering to destroy something good. But he had assumed those forces were motivated by business competition or ideological opposition to their work. He had not imagined that the opposition might be connected to his own personal history. The investigation into who's been funding the attacks on our project led us to some unexpected discoveries. Attorney Walsh continued, opening her own file folder to reveal what looked like financial records, insurance documents, and correspondence spanning several years. It turns out that the Henderson family fire and your subsequent legal troubles were not as straightforward as they appeared. She handed Niko a copy of an internal memorandum from Consolidated National Insurance, the company that had handled the Henderson family's homeowners policy. The document was marked confidential and dated just 2 weeks after the fire that had destroyed his life. Internal memo recommends aggressive pursuit of contractor liability to minimize company payout exposure. Niko read aloud, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. Subject: Ramos appears vulnerable to pressure given business, financial difficulties. Suggest emphasizing negligence angle regardless of technical findings. The words hit him like physical blows. For 3 years, he had carried the weight of responsibility for the Henderson tragedy, accepting the insurance investigator's conclusion that his wiring error had caused the fire. He had rebuilt his understanding of himself around that guilt, using it as both punishment and motivation to somehow make amends through his current work. "There's more," Attorney Walsh said gently, producing another document, this one a technical report that had apparently been suppressed during the original investigation. The independent electrical analysis commissioned by the insurance company found that your wiring was correct. The fire was caused by a manufacturing defect in the electrical panel itself, a defect the manufacturer knew about but had not disclosed. Juliet reached over and took Niko's hand as he struggled to process what he was hearing. The foundation of his guilt, the reason for his licensing revocation, the justification for his 3 years of homelessness, all of it based on deliberately falsified evidence designed to protect an insurance company's profit margins. The panel manufacturer, Electrical Systems International, had received dozens of complaints about overheating and fire risks, Attorney Walsh continued. But rather than issue a recall, they chose to settle individual claims quietly and let their insurance companies pursue contractors and homeowners for liability. Marcus leaned forward, his analyst's mind already working through the implications. So Niko was framed to cover up a product defect. Essentially, yes. The insurance company needed someone to blame to avoid paying the full claim. The manufacturer needed the insurance company to avoid investigating the panel defect. And Mr. Ramos was the most convenient target, a small business owner without the resources to fight back effectively. Niko felt as though the world was shifting beneath him. Everything he had believed about his own culpability, every moment of guilt and self-recrimination, every night spent sleeping rough while believing he deserved no better, all of it based on a lie constructed to protect corporate interests. "How did you discover this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The same people who are trying to destroy your community's project made a mistake," Attorney Walsh replied. "They hired a private investigation firm to dig up dirt on your background, hoping to discredit you and damage Ashford Renewable's reputation. But the investigators they hired were more thorough than expected. They found the suppressed evidence and realized they had stumbled onto something much bigger than their clients had anticipated." She handed him another document, this one a private investigator's report that detailed the connections between Consolidated National Insurance, Electrical Systems International, and the corporate entities now attempting to take over Ashford. "Renewable solutions. It's all connected," Juliet said, her voice carrying a mixture of rage and amazement. "The same insurance conglomerate that destroyed your life 3 years ago is now trying to destroy our company because we're proving that their assumptions about homeless people are wrong." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The investigation revealed that Consolidated National Insurance was part of a larger corporate network that included real estate development companies, private prison operators, and social services contractors, all of whom profited from maintaining homelessness rather than solving it. The success of the second chance communities represented a direct threat to business models that depended on human misery. "They can't allow your project to succeed," Attorney Walsh explained, because it proves that homelessness is solvable with relatively modest investment. If other cities adopt your model, it could cost their network billions in profits from shelter. Contracts, social services, and real estate speculation. Marcus was studying financial documents that showed the web of corporate relationships. So they're trying to take over Ashford Renewable to shut down the community's project. And they're using Niko's fabricated history to justify their actions. Exactly. But their overreach has given us an opportunity. The evidence of their conspiracy in the Henderson case is so clear that we can not only clear Mr. Ramos's name, but potentially expose the entire network. Niko looked up from the documents, his mind reeling from the implications. Maria and David Henderson, do they know about this? We contacted them yesterday, Attorney Walsh replied. They were as shocked as you are. They want to meet with you, actually. They felt guilty for years about how aggressively they pursued the lawsuit, especially after they learned more about insurance company tactics. The revelation that the Henderson family, whose loss had haunted him for 3 years, might not blame him, after all, was almost too much to process. Niko felt as though he was emerging from a 3-year nightmare to discover that the world was completely different than he had believed. What happens now? Juliet asked, her hand still clasped in his. Now we have choices, Attorney Walsh replied. We can pursue criminal charges against the insurance company and the manufacturer. We can file civil suits for damages. And we can use this evidence to defend against the hostile takeover attempt. She pulled out one final document, a proposed legal strategy that would simultaneously clear Niko's name, expose the conspiracy, and protect Ashford Renewable from corporate attack. But, she continued, going public with this information will bring enormous attention to all of you. The community's project will become a symbol in a much larger fight about corporate accountability and social justice. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and conflict? Niko looked around the conference room at the people who had become his closest allies and friends. Just months ago, he had been a homeless man grateful for a sandwich. Now he was being offered the chance to reclaim not just his reputation, but to strike a blow against the forces that had destroyed his life and continued to destroy the lives of others. Those communities we're building, he said slowly, they're full of people who've been discarded by a system that profits from their suffering. If we have a chance to change that system, how can we not take it? Juliet squeezed his hand. Together, he confirmed. As they prepared to leave the law office, none of them could have imagined the battle that lay ahead, or that their fight for justice would transform them from local advocates into national symbols of a movement that would challenge some of the most powerful interests in American society. But they were about to discover that sometimes the most important fights are the ones you never expected to have, and that the most powerful weapon against corruption is simply telling the truth. The USB drive containing evidence of the conspiracy against Niko and Ashford Renewable Solutions sat in the center of the conference table like a small digital bomb, its innocent appearance belying the explosive revelations stored within its memory. 3 days had passed since the legal meeting that changed everything, and now the war room atmosphere in Juliet's home office reflected the magnitude of the battle they were preparing to fight. Maps, financial documents, media contact lists, and legal briefs covered every available surface. Laptops displayed real-time stock prices, news feeds, and social media monitoring dashboards. The upcoming press conference, scheduled for the following morning, would simultaneously clear Niko's name, expose corporate corruption, and defend their community's project against the most sophisticated attack any of them had ever faced. The Henderson family will speak first, Marcus explained, reviewing the press conference timeline for the 4th time that evening. They'll describe how they learned about the insurance fraud and their decision to support Niko publicly. Then Niko presents the technical evidence about the electrical panel defect. Finally, Juliet connects everything to the current attack on the community's project. David Henderson had called that afternoon to confirm their participation. His voice had carried 3 years of accumulated guilt and relief as he explained how the revelation of the insurance conspiracy had finally made sense of doubts they had harbored about the original investigation. Maria Henderson, he said, had cried when she learned the truth, not from renewed grief, but from joy that the man they had blamed might finally find peace. "The media response will be intense," warned Jennifer Walsh, who had spent the day coordinating with journalists from major national outlets. This story combines corporate conspiracy, social justice, personal redemption, and a billionaire romance. Every network will want exclusive interviews. Every newspaper will want follow-up stories. Are you prepared for that level of attention? Niko stood at the window overlooking the grounds where he had first approached as a desperate homeless man just months earlier. The transformation in his circumstances still felt surreal, but it was nothing compared to the emotional revolution of learning that his 3 years of guilt and self-punishment had been based on deliberate lies. "I keep thinking about all the other people," he said, turning back to the group. "How many other contractors have been framed by insurance companies? How many other families have been denied rightful compensation? How many other people are sleeping on the streets tonight because of these companies' business model?" Juliet moved to stand beside him, their professional partnership having evolved into something deeper over the intense weeks of preparation. The romantic feelings that had been building between them throughout their collaboration had crystallized during the crisis. As they realized that their connection transcended business success or personal attraction, they shared a commitment to justice that made them stronger together than either could be alone. "That's why we're doing this," she said, her hand finding his. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's been destroyed by these systems." The preparation for tomorrow's press conference had been exhaustive. They had rehearsed every statement, anticipated every possible question, and coordinated with their legal team to ensure that their revelations would trigger immediate investigations by federal agencies. The evidence was so comprehensive that Attorney Walsh expected criminal charges within weeks and civil settlements within months, but success would come at a cost. Sarah Chen had resigned that afternoon, her departure statement citing fundamental disagreements about corporate direction that everyone understood was code for unwillingness to fight powerful interests. 3 board members had requested emergency meetings to discuss their liability exposure. Stock prices had already begun fluctuating based on rumors about the upcoming announcement. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, consulting his laptop, with the expression he wore when delivering news that no one wanted to hear. "The private investigators hired by Consolidated National have been busy. They've reached out to every media contact, every former employee, every business associate from Niko's past. They're preparing their own narrative for tomorrow." He turned his screen toward the group, showing a draft press release that portrayed Niko as an unstable fraud who had manipulated Juliet's sympathies for personal gain. The document painted their community's project as financially irresponsible and suggested that Ashford Renewables shareholders were being victimized by their CEO's romantic attachment to a homeless con artist. "They're going to attack our credibility rather than defend their actions," Niko observed, studying the hostile narrative with the analytical calm he had developed during his years of surviving on the streets. "Make this about my character rather than their conspiracy." "Which is exactly what we expected," Attorney Walsh replied. "That's why we've been so thorough with our documentation. Facts will win this fight, not public relations spin." The evening was interrupted by a call from the Second Chance communities, where residents had gathered for an emergency meeting after learning about the attacks on their program. Maria Santos, the former software engineer who had become an informal leader among the community members, spoke for the group. "We wanted you to know that we're with you," she said, her voice strong despite the phone's speaker distortion. "All of us Whatever these people try to do, they're not just attacking you, they're attacking every person who's been given a second chance here. The community members had prepared their own statements for the media, describing how the program had changed their lives and their commitment to defending it against corporate interests that profited from homelessness. Their willingness to speak publicly, despite the vulnerability of their situations, added a powerful dimension to tomorrow's presentation. 43 people have graduated from our program, Niko said after the call ended. 43 people who were written off by society, but who had skills, knowledge, and determination that just needed opportunity. Tomorrow, we're not just defending our project, we're proving that everyone deserves a chance to rebuild. As the night deepened, their preparation intensified. Juliet reviewed financial projections that demonstrated the community's project's viability and social impact. Marcus coordinated with friendly journalists to ensure accurate coverage. Attorney Walsh prepared legal documents that would be filed immediately after the press conference to prevent corporate retaliation. But beyond the strategic preparation, all of them were processing the personal transformation that had brought them to this moment. 6 months earlier, Niko had been a homeless man whose life seemed irredeemably destroyed. Juliet had been a successful but isolated billionaire whose humanitarian impulses were expressed through distant charitable giving. Now they were partners in both business and life, preparing to take on some of the most powerful interests in American society. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Juliet said as they prepared to leave the office for a few hours of rest, "I want you to know that meeting you changed everything for me. Not just the business, not just the community's project, but my understanding of what wealth and influence should be used for. I spent 3 years believing I was responsible for destroying a family," Niko replied. "Tomorrow we expose the people who were actually responsible, not just for the Henderson fire, but for a system that destroys lives for profit. It feels like the ending of one story and the beginning of another." The USB drive remained on the conference table as they gathered their materials, its digital contents representing thousands of pages of evidence that would reshape their understanding of corporate accountability and social justice. But more than evidence, it represented hope, the possibility that truth could triumph over power, that justice could prevail over profit, and that people who had been discarded by society could prove their worth when given genuine opportunities. As they prepared to leave for the night, Marcus made one final check of the press conference logistics. "Reporters will start arriving at 7 a.m. The Henderson family will be there by 8. Attorney Walsh will have the legal filings ready to submit immediately after the presentation, and security will be in place to handle whatever disruptions Consolidated National might attempt." "Are you nervous?" Juliet asked Niko as they walked toward the mansion's front door. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also ready. For 3 years, I've been living with shame that wasn't mine to carry. Tomorrow, I give it back to the people who created it." Outside, Seattle's autumn night was clear and cold, the kind of weather that reminded residents why they appreciated the cozy warmth of indoor spaces. As Niko looked up at the stars barely visible beyond the city's light pollution, he thought about all the people who would spend this night without shelter, without hope, without the opportunities that had transformed his own life. Tomorrow would determine whether their model for addressing homelessness would survive to help those people, or whether corporate interests would succeed in destroying an approach that threatened their profits. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Nico Ramos slept without guilt, knowing that the shame he had carried belonged to others, and that tomorrow he would finally have the chance to give it back. The press conference podium stood at the center of Ashford Renewable Solutions' main conference room, like an altar where truth would finally be served. By 9 a.m., the space was packed with reporters from local and national outlets, their cameras and recording equipment, creating a forest of technology focused on the small wooden platform where lives would be changed and reputations either destroyed or redeemed. Niko adjusted his tie for the 5th time that morning. The same nervous gesture he had made before his first board presentation months earlier. But this time, the stakes extended far beyond corporate approval or project funding. Today's revelations would either vindicate 3 years of suffering or confirm his enemy's portrayal of him as a manipulative fraud who had deceived a wealthy woman for personal gain. "Remember," Attorney Walsh whispered as she made final adjustments. To the microphone, "Stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak for itself. Don't get drawn into personal attacks or emotional responses." David and Maria Henderson sat in the front row, their presence representing a courage that Niko still found difficult to comprehend. For them to publicly admit their mistake in blaming him required a strength that transcended their own grief and embarrassment. Maria had spoken to him privately that morning, her eyes bright with tears as she apologized for 3 years of hatred based on lies they had all believed. "We know now that you lost everything trying to help us," she had said. "Today, we help. You get your life back." Juliet stepped to the podium first, her business attire and confident bearing commanding immediate attention from the assembled media. As CEO of a billion-dollar company, her words carried weight that would amplify everything. That followed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority, "we are here today to expose a conspiracy that has destroyed lives, corrupted investigations, and perpetuated homelessness for corporate profit. What you will hear today will shock you, but more importantly, it will demonstrate why transparency and accountability are essential to justice." She outlined the scope of the investigation, the connections between insurance fraud and the current attacks on their community's project, and the evidence that would exonerate Niko while exposing a network of corporate corruption that reached into multiple industries. The man you will hear from today was not just a victim of this conspiracy. He has become a symbol of what is possible when we choose justice over profit, when we choose to rebuild rather than simply punish, when we choose to see potential rather than just problems. David Henderson approached the podium next, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded prepared remarks that had been rewritten multiple times during sleepless nights of wrestling with 3 years of misdirected anger. "My wife and I lost our daughter Sophia because of a defective electrical panel," he said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "For 3 years, we blamed Nico Ramos for our loss. We were wrong. The real culprits were corporations that chose profit over safety, that chose to frame an innocent man rather than accept responsibility for their defective products." He described the original investigation, the pressure they had felt to pursue legal action, and the growing doubts they had harbored about the official conclusions. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity, a father describing how grief had been weaponized by insurance companies to destroy an innocent man's life. "Nico Ramos didn't cause the fire that killed our daughter," David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "but the people who did cause it used our grief to destroy his life. Today, we stand with him to expose the truth and to ensure that no other family suffers what we suffered and no other person endures what he endured." Maria Henderson joined her husband at the podium, her statement brief but powerful. "We have lived with guilt for 3 years, knowing that our lawsuit destroyed a good man's life. Today we ask for his forgiveness, and we commit ourselves to fighting the corporations that manipulated our tragedy for their profit." The media response was immediate and intense. Reporters began asking rapid-fire questions about the technical details of the panel defect, the insurance company's role in suppressing evidence, and the current corporate attacks on the community's project. Each answer built a comprehensive picture of systemic corruption that extended far beyond a single electrical fire. When Niko finally approached the podium, the room fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The homeless, Electrician, whose story had captured national attention, would finally tell his side of a narrative that had been controlled by others for 3 years. "My name is Nico Ramos," he began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to speak truth regardless of the consequences. 3 years ago, I was a successful electrical contractor with 25 years of experience and a reputation for quality work. Today, I stand before you as proof that corporate greed can destroy anyone's life, but also as proof that truth can survive any lie and that justice can triumph over profit when good people choose to fight for it. He held up copies of the suppressed technical reports that proved his innocence, the insurance company memos that revealed their deliberate fraud, and the evidence connecting the conspiracy to current attacks on homeless communities across the country. The people who destroyed my life thought they could silence me by taking away my home, my business and my reputation, Niko continued. They were wrong. Today, we take back the truth they stole. Today, we expose the conspiracy they thought they could hide. And today, we prove that some things are more powerful than corporate corruption. Courage, justice, and the determination to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. The simple wedding ring set that Niko had purchased from a downtown jeweler 3 days earlier sat in his jacket pocket as he finished his testimony, the weight of the rings reminding him that this moment was about more than vindication. It was about claiming a future he had never dared to imagine during his years of exile and shame. As the press conference concluded and reporters began filing their stories, the immediate response exceeded everyone's expectations. Within an hour, Consolidated National Insurance's stock price had dropped 15%. Federal investigators announced they were opening formal inquiries into the electrical panel defects and insurance fraud. Most importantly, public sentiment was shifting dramatically in favor of the community's project and against the corporate interests that had tried to destroy it. "The board vote is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Marcus announced as they gathered in Juliet's office to monitor the media reaction. "But given what just happened, I think we can expect unanimous support for continuing the community's project." He was right. When Ashford Renewables board convened that afternoon, the mood was markedly different from the skeptical questioning that had characterized previous meetings. The morning's revelations had transformed Niko from a potential liability into a symbol of corporate accountability and social justice. More importantly, the community's project was no longer seen as a risky humanitarian venture, but as a proven model for addressing one of society's most intractable problems. Sarah Chen's replacement, Dr. Patricia Williams, a former urban planning professor who had joined the board specifically to support the community's initiative, led the discussion with enthusiasm that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. "The media coverage has been uniformly positive," she reported. "More importantly, we've received inquiries from 12 cities requesting proposals for similar communities. The pilot project isn't just successful, it's become a template for national expansion. The vote to continue and expand the Second Chance communities was unanimous. But more than that, the board approved additional funding for legal action against the corporations that had conspired to frame Niko and attack their project. Ashford Renewable Solutions was transforming from a company that simply avoided harm into one that actively fought injustice. As the board meeting concluded, Niko found himself standing with Juliet in the same conference room where he had given his first presentation months earlier. The transformation in their circumstances was remarkable, but the transformation in their relationship was even more profound. "I have something to ask you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing the small jewelry box that contained rings he had chosen not for their value, but for their symbolism, simple bands that represented commitment beyond wealth or status. Juliet's eyes widened as she recognized what was happening. In all her careful planning for business expansion and social impact, she had not anticipated this moment. But as Niko knelt before her in the conference room, where their professional partnership had flourished, she realized that their connection had always been deeper than business success or shared humanitarian goals. "Juliet Ashford," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence he had used to address the media that morning. "You saved my life in ways I'm still discovering. You gave me hope when I had forgotten what hope felt like. You showed me that second chances are real when you believe in someone enough to fight for them. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, her answer carrying the certainty of someone who had built a fortune by trusting her instincts about people and opportunities. "Yes, absolutely, yes." As they embraced in the conference room overlooking Elliott Bay, both of them were aware that their love story would become part of the larger narrative about justice, redemption, and the power of believing in human potential. The media would certainly cover their engagement, but more importantly, their partnership represented proof that some connections transcend circumstances and that love can flourish even in the midst of fighting powerful adversaries. The celebration of their engagement was interrupted by Marcus, who burst into the conference room with news that completed their victory over the forces that had tried to destroy them. "Consolidated National just announced they're settling," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "Full admission of wrongdoing, complete restoration of Niko's professional reputation, and financial compensation that will fund community expansion for the next 5 years. The settlement represented more than money. It was vindication that justice could prevail over corporate power when ordinary people had the courage to fight back. But the victory extended beyond their personal circumstances to impact thousands of homeless individuals who would benefit from expanded communities. Programs. There's more," Marcus continued. "The electrical panel manufacturer is issuing a recall and settling a class action lawsuit. The private investigation firm that worked for Consolidated National is cooperating with federal investigators. And 3 other insurance companies are under investigation for similar fraud schemes." As the scope of their victory became clear, Niko and Juliet realized that their fight had triggered something much larger than they had intended. Their willingness to expose the truth about corporate conspiracy had opened floodgates of accountability that would protect other vulnerable people from similar exploitation. "We did it," Juliet said, still holding Niko close as they processed the magnitude of what they had accomplished together. "We actually did it. We proved that truth is stronger than money," Niko replied. "We proved that justice is possible when people choose to fight for it. And we proved that love can survive anything when it's built on real partnership and shared values." As Seattle's afternoon light streamed through the conference room windows, illuminating the couple who had transformed from unlikely allies into life partners, the future stretched before them, with possibilities neither could have imagined. When a storm first brought them together, 6 months after the press conference that changed everything, Niko stood on the stage of the Seattle Convention Center, accepting the Golden Hammer Award for Outstanding Innovation in Humanitarian Engineering. The award itself, a simple tool, transformed into a symbol of building hope from difficult circumstances, represented everything he had learned about the dignity of work and the power of second chances. The ceremony took place on a crisp April evening, with over 1,000 attendees, representing the best of Seattle's business, nonprofit, and political communities. But the faces that mattered most to Niko were in the front rows, residents from all 3 second-chance communities, their success stories serving as living proof that homelessness was a condition that could be solved rather than simply managed. "This award doesn't belong to me," Niko said, his voice carrying easily across the convention center as he addressed the audience. "It belongs to every person who refused to accept that homelessness was inevitable, who believed that everyone deserves a chance to rebuild, and who proved that the most valuable innovations come from understanding real human needs." The communities had exceeded every projection. The original warehouse facility now housed 48 families in permanent housing units, with a waiting list that stretched into the hundreds. The Portland and San Francisco locations were operational and expanding. Most remarkably, the model was being replicated in 12 additional cities, funded by a combination of federal grants, private investment, and municipal partnerships that treated housing as infrastructure rather than charity. Maria Santos, the former software engineer who had become the program's first graduate to earn a master's degree in social work, approached the podium to introduce the evening's keynote speaker. Her transformation from homeless individual to community advocate represented the kind of success that policy experts had claimed was impossible to achieve at scale. 6 months ago, our program was under attack by people who profited from keeping us homeless, she said, her confidence a testament to the power of stable housing and meaningful work. Tonight, we celebrate not just survival, but transformation. We celebrate the proof that given opportunity, anyone can rebuild their life. The evening's celebration culminated with the wedding of Niko and Juliet, held in the same convention center where their professional partnership had been honored. The ceremony combined the elegant simplicity they both preferred with the joyful chaos of a community celebration that included friends from every level of Seattle society. David and Maria Henderson served as witnesses, their presence completing the circle of healing that had begun with that terrible night 3 years earlier. During the ceremony, Maria Henderson read a letter from their daughter Sophia's memory fund, which now provided scholarships for formerly homeless individuals pursuing electrical and engineering training. Love is the force that transforms tragedy into hope, she read, her voice steady and warm. Sophia's memory lives on in every life that is rebuilt, every person who is given a second chance, every family that finds safety and dignity through the work that Niko and Juliet do together. The reception moved to the rooftop of the Ashford Renewable Solutions building, where Niko's innovative solar panel arrays provided both electrical power and symbolic illumination for the celebration. The view stretched across Elliott Bay to the Olympic Mountains, the same vista that had seemed impossibly distant during his homeless years, but now felt like a promise of limitless possibility. As the evening progressed, Niko found himself in conversation with a group of formerly homeless individuals who had become electrical apprentices through the community's program. Their questions were technical and sophisticated, reflecting the kind of engagement with complex systems that most people assumed was beyond the capacity of homeless populations. The key insight, Niko explained to the group, is that homelessness doesn't destroy intelligence or skill. It just removes the platform from which people can demonstrate their capabilities. Give someone stable housing, basic tools, and genuine opportunity, and you'll be amazed at what they can accomplish. The success of the second chance communities had attracted attention from the highest levels of government. Federal officials were studying the model for potential national implementation. International delegations had visited to understand how sustainable housing could be combined with economic development. Most importantly, other cities were discovering that addressing homelessness was not just morally necessary, but economically beneficial. Juliet joined him on the rooftop terrace, her wedding dress catching the light from the solar array that represented their shared commitment to innovation in service of human dignity. In her hands, she carried a tablet displaying real-time data from all their community locations: energy production, housing occupancy, job placement rates, and resident satisfaction scores that consistently exceeded benchmarks. "Look at this," she said, showing him the metrics that had become their shared obsession. 93% of residents maintain stable housing after graduation. 87% find permanent employment within 6 months. But the number I'm most proud of is this one. 99% report that the program gave them hope As the celebration continued around them, they stood together looking out over the city where their partnership had begun during a storm that brought them together by chance, but united them through choice. The lights of Seattle stretched to the horizon, each point of illumination representing a life, a family, a story of struggle and survival. "Do you ever think about that night?" Juliet asked, referring to the storm that had started everything. "About how different things could have been if you hadn't knocked on my door." "Every day," Niko replied, putting his arm around his new wife as they watched the city lights reflect on Elliott Bay. "But not with regret, with gratitude. That storm brought us together, but everything that followed happened because we chose to believe that people deserve second chances, that justice is worth fighting for, and that love can transform everything when it's built on genuine partnership." The Golden Hammer Award sat on a nearby table, its polished surface reflecting the lights of the city and the success of communities that had proven wrong everyone who claimed that homelessness was an intractable problem. But more than an award, it represented hope. The hope that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to build, to heal, to transform tragedy into triumph through the simple act of believing in human potential. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Niko and Juliet remained on the rooftop, planning the next phase of their work together. There were more communities to build, more lives to transform, more proof to provide that the most valuable things in life, love, justice, dignity, hope, were available to everyone willing to fight for them.